Hello, and welcome to episode 32 of Bills with Luke Scorzel. If you've listened before, you know that the goal of this podcast is not only to provide an objective viewpoint on proposed policy and legislation, but also to have respectful, thought-provoking conversations with people from all backgrounds. This goal is meant to help heal the growing divide between Americans of opposing viewpoints. It is to shed light on the commonalities we share, on the reasoning behind our decisions, and on the research behind our policies. And on today's episode, the second part of my interview with Michael Johns, we do just that. We analyze trade, immigration, and gun policy, but we also discuss the causes of this growing divide between Americans and what some of the solutions might be. The best way to go into a conversation is with an open mind and a willingness to listen, so I hope you'll do that today. Stay tuned. I'm Luke Scorzel, and you're listening to Bills. A big thank you to Zach for becoming a $30 per month Patreon supporter. I can't thank him enough. Simply amazing when I saw that. So he listened to last week's episode, the first part of our interview, and he decided to give $30 a month to the show. And again, I cannot thank him more. He's helped move the show forward a lot. Additionally, I'd like to thank our $15 per month patrons, Mike, Julie, and Tiana. All have generously decided to support the show with monthly donations of $15. You can find Mike online at lakearrowheadbuilder.com. He has one of the most impressive home portfolios in Southern California, so go check that out. You can find Tiana online at benchmarkbicycle.com. Benchmark Bicycle is a full-service bicycle shop in Greer, South Carolina, made for cyclists by cyclists, so go give it a look. And a big thank you to Julie as well. Every ounce of support helps. And thank you also to our $1 and $5 patrons. We appreciate you as well. So with that level of support, the $15 to get access to any social giveaways and promotions, a shout out at the beginning and end of the show, exclusive Patreon-only posts, a sticker, and the ability to participate in the mailbag. So a lot of stuff for my patrons over there. So patreon.com/BillsLukeScorzel if you feel so inspired by the end of the show. I would greatly appreciate it. And again, we have stickers out, and they're simply amazing, and I love them a lot. So if you go and you want to support future episodes, get on the show listed as a supporter, then again, head over to patreon.com. So without further ado, let's get into our interview.
Trump, clearly is an amalgamation of both sentiments and issues and of his own dynamic, incredibly strong personality. Yet he was a Tea Party candidate, and I believe he's a Tea Party president.
Mm-hmm. We're here now with Donald Trump, and I mean, he's conservative. A lot of his policies are conservative. Some of his talk is a little out there at points.
It's the textbook. But we believe some of the textbook's been written by Swamp. So, there's a false illusion that's been created in this country of us against them, of these parties against each other, of rigid ideological adherence. And I know that he's lost some support because he's not spoken from, the conservative hawking points all the time. And that's particularly true in the trade debate. But you can't deny the reality of the fact that we have run up these monstrous multi-billion-dollar trade deficits with our so-called trading partners, that they have imposed immense tariffs on our exports, and we've done nothing on their imports. There's on the trade issue, yes, there's been some benefits to the American consumer, probably with lower priced products in some areas, but it's been at the expense of the complete decimation of the manufacturing sector in this country. That's an undeniable fact. And it's also a lot of conjecture right now, and this is obviously a very present tense debate. It's a lot of conjecture to say that, well, our tariffs are now just going to lead to some reciprocity, and this is going to be like an escalating trade war. That may or may not prove to be the case. It is intriguing to me that the very day that the president rolled out the proposed tariffs on steel and aluminum at the 25% and 10% respectively, that you had high-level trade representatives from China in Washington, D.C., with some degree of desperation and urgency, trying to get the attention of the administration and resolve some of these issues. Now, we just tell you, they weren't here during the Obama administration. They weren't here really for the most part during the Bush 43 administrations. They had everything they wanted. So you now have in Mexico City, in Beijing, in the EU, in Brussels, you've got people paying attention to the fact that we do not have a fair trading relationship with these monstrous markets of the world. And they acknowledge it. So if they acknowledge it, why is it unreasonable for us to acknowledge it as well? And to sort of say that maybe in the best case scenario, which I believe is going to prove to be the case, that these tariffs prove to be very short term. And it's almost like, yes, we have a short term war, but ultimately the war ends. And from the emergence of the war develops a legitimate, more fairly balanced trade relationship that ultimately leads to the benefit of American exports and a restoration of and an elimination of the need for tariffs on foreign exporters into our country. So we get the best of both worlds. We both maintain access to reasonably priced products from these major trade partners, but we also are able to turn around and salvage the decimation of just the numerous American industries that we have handed to China and Mexico as a result of not paying any attention to this, or as a result of rigidly believing that so-called free trade, I'm not sure it's free, but that free trade in and of itself was just serving some higher end. And the forgotten man and woman, which the president's spoken about, takes great issue with that, because the free trade arguments of, the icons of free market thinking that you and I are aware of and have read aren't meaningful to their lives. What's meaningful to them is the fact that they spent years, decades even, developing careers in certain sectors, particularly in high-end manufacturing, and that was their life. And it was true in coal mining as well. And I believe you can see even in this current opium crisis and the immense rise of mental health issues in a lot of these places, that there has been undeniable societal level impact of us just turning our back on these people. And so this plays out in ways that we can't predict. I mean, you don't know for sure. I don't know for sure either, to be fair. But I do believe for the first time, at least we have these trading partners paying attention to the fact that we feel it's been an unequal and unlevel relationship. And now a lot of it obviously is going to be in their court as far as what they want to do. If they turn around and say, hey, look, we're going to double the tariffs that we have on your exports, that's entirely conceivable that ends up happening. But I'm going to tell you something. I believe that this remains the biggest, and this is the biggest slice of the pie as far as the consumer market of the world goes. Nobody wants to close out the United States. China's wealth has been built on exports to the United States. China's future depends on its access to the United States. And it's true of Mexico as well. It's true of Canada. I think the president very astutely recognizes that we're in the driver's seat there, and also that the argument is just sensible. I mean, you can't have one country, and I'm not even addressing all the other benefits that they have, the fact that they don't adhere to the labor standards that we adhere to, they don't have the regulatory and burdens that we have, that they have no, for the most part, minimum wage laws or labor rights restrictions, people working 14, 16, 18 hours a day, whatever. In many of these emerging markets, that's great for the productivity of those countries and their competitiveness, but it's hardly fair when we're not on the same playing field. And those issues aren't even being addressed. But at least on the tariff issue, I believe you're going to start to see trade representatives in these major foreign markets, in Ottawa, Mexico City, Brussels, and most importantly, Beijing, come and say, look, let's work this out. And if that happens, is it not true that Donald Trump ends up being the biggest proponent and success story of American free trade of modern times? I believe it does. Because I think you're going to see American exports blossom incredibly, and trade will become even more central part of our GDP and of our productivity going forward.
Then how does this type of, I guess, trade war? The other day on Twitter, Trump was almost proposing that we get into a trade war with some of these countries. I mean, you think based on what you know that it will reset itself, I guess, and in the benefit of the American people. But in the midst of this trade war, then how are American consumers and American workers impacted by tariffs on imports to the country?
Well, what we're going to do, and you saw this with the U.S. based steel executives and companies that were represented this past week in steel and in aluminum. We're just taking two industries. So, these issues are applicable in broadly across many, many industries. So like nothing's addressing low end manufacturing. There's nothing here that, we're just dealing with two sectors that I think the president's correctly pointed out, are crucial to America's national security. So for instance, if we ended up in a protracted conflict, a military conflict in the world that required the manufacturing of military equipment, and we had no indigenous capability to manufacture steel or aluminum in this country, we would be reliant upon many of the countries that I just mentioned to assist us. And it's entirely conceivable they may choose not to for strategic purposes. So in a world where China and Russia particularly, I think, are engaged in a geopolitical, I would say, rivalry of the U.S., but it's got a national security component to it. We need to be able to produce these things indigenously. And if that deviates from the theories of Ludwig von Mises, oh well, I think is the response that most Americans would say. We can't put ourselves in a position where we are that dependent upon foreign countries, particularly who really they certainly haven't proven allies. I mean, they're not necessarily adversaries, but they haven't proven allies. And so on a strategic basis alone, it makes sense. And then once you get into the fact that, well, gee, that the option is really to do nothing, to let this continue to grow, and they're never going to change their policies, right? And then we never change ours. So we just continue to see the flow of wealth and jobs out of the United States into these foreign markets, and everything would continue to move in that direction. You now have their attention. So where does this go from now? Well, now all of a sudden, I think you got the trade representative of the U.S. who's got like a legitimate job in front of them. But now you really can sit down and say, how do we structure this in a way that is, as we've always said, it is a true partnership, in a way that is working for the American economy and the American worker and for these American sectors, and works for them too. And I think now you're going to start to see those high-level discussions. But it's kind of like I said the other day, it's sort of peace through strength, where on the surface, if you don't look at it deeply, you might say, well, you're making all this, you're deploying all these missiles, or you're advancing strategic defense, you're threatening the peace. No, you're advancing the peace, because you're putting the United States in a position of strategic leadership as opposed to passivity and complacency. And I think that clearly there was a mandate in 2016 on these issues. And I think the president, a year now into his presidency, is getting around to it. And I think he's got a very, very compelling case. And I think it could play out in a way that even the most purist libertarians and free trade proponents look back and go, wow, that really did work. And I say this as someone who championed NAFTA, okay, in the early parts of the Clinton administration. And I looked at all the data as a foreign policy analyst at Heritage that many of us looked at, okay? And honestly, the origin of most of it was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And they came to us and a few other, areas, but the people that had really done the primary research on the data that suggested that this was going to prove beneficial to the American economy had statistics and data that never played out in reality. Now, I don't know this is what frustrates the American people with the swamp. I am like an honest person. In my judgment, I look at this and I say, okay, what I looked at back in whatever 1991 seemed to make sense, but in retrospect, in 2018, didn't play out that way. And here's why it didn't play out that way. But you can't look back. There's too many, I think, inside the Beltway and within the Republican Party establishment today that just simply won't say, you know what, we got this wrong. Because you know what, honestly, I think the American people would appreciate that. And how, it's a complex issue. Like you're going to not be consistently right all the time. But to sort of look on this and say, well, we're not going to, criticize this, or we're not going to admit that we had an error of judgment, to me, it's just such political arrogance. And that's exactly what's propelled this president to his position. And I think that's what continues to propel the vast grassroots political support that's behind him, because it's honesty. You mentioned the tweet that he put out about welcoming trade wars. I think what he said was that these wars are easy to win. This man, in my judgment, I get criticized sometimes for being too for inflating his skill set, but just having brushed up against him and followed him so closely, this man is a very unique leader. He's not he is hugely underestimated. And his command of the language in this debate is just incredible. And one of the first things he did, which I observed right away the last few days, is stop using the word tariff. Most Americans can tell you what tariff is. Okay, that's Washington doublespeak, and it's not meaningful. So he started talking about it in terms of a tax. Well, the American people know what a tax is, and that's really ultimately what a tariff is. A tariff is a tax. A tax is a tariff. So when you say foreign markets are taxing our goods and we're not taxing theirs, all of a sudden, I think the person on the street says, well, that's not fair. And they'd be right in that judgment. And I think he also, as opposed to dodging the issue of trade war, since that's the fear that the proponents of this status quo trade arrangement put out there, that he's going to spark a trade war, I think he's taking that on head on. So he said, okay, we'll welcome that. We'll say it's a war that can be won. Because the reality is, he's not starting the trade war. He could be ending the trade war. The trade war has been perpetuated for 3 or 4 decades against this country. We just haven't fought back.
So we talk about these policies that Trump had proposed and how trade will, in essence, is one of the ones that he had a mandate to work on, however that plays out. But I'd also like to talk about immigration, because the trade comes with the idea, and I think Obama especially perpetuated it, of this globalist world where there are no borders, and it goes into the free trade type of ideology as well a little bit. But what is your stance on a lot of this immigration stuff? During the campaign, Trump had talked about building the wall and being very stringent on immigration policy. And I think recently we've also seen a little bit of a loosening on that, which I would say is good politically for Trump, but it also goes a little against what he originally stated on how he stood on immigration. So he was going to let DACA expire, but then the White House proposed a policy that proposed legalizing almost or more than double the amount of immigrants in the country than DACA. And then on top of that, they want to process the backlog on chain migration, which will take up to 17 years and then allow an additional few million immigrants into the country. So it's almost as if he's gone back on that a little bit. Can you explain this?
It's easily explained. It's it's the fact that unlike some foreign countries, the U.S. president's not a dictator. He needs Congress to partner with him on this. So you had and by the way, all of these stories, both the trade story and the immigration story, as much as they can sort of, I think, deteriorate into kind of what sound like granular policy detail, they tell a much broader, I think, story of the evolution of American politics. Because there once was a time in my lifetime when the Democratic Party was the party of unions, and unions felt very threatened by the emergence of illegal cheap labor in this country. So all of these, Obama included, all of these individuals, you go back, and Pelosi, et cetera, you go back and look at what they were saying 15 years ago or so about these issues. They supported securing the border. They felt illegal immigration in this country was a threat to the country, at least economically, and to the American worker. And they were proponents of, I think, logic of a country without borders is not a country. I think Reagan said that, and they were proponents more or less of that thesis. And then if you look at how it played out, I think in '86, you kind of had the trade-off between what was the first, DACA in a lot of ways. You had the mass amnesty afforded many immigrants in this country in exchange for a commitment to border security that Democrats never lived up to, and the Republican Party never insisted that they live up to. And now a recognition, unbelievably, that in 2018 still, we have a porous southern border. No one can even tell, by the way, anyone who says they know how many illegal immigrants are in this country is just making it up. They're manufacturing it. So some say it's as low as 11 million. I believe it's probably 30 million or more. And that only begins to tell the story of the problem with immigration. 9/11 itself was, in many ways, a failure of U.S. immigration. We had terrorist bombers in this country with malevolent intentions who never should have been here, and a good number of them who were on overstayed visas, which, by the way, we still do not police in any way. This is the only country in the world where you can arrive with a short-term visiting visa and never leave, and no one will ever ask you to leave. And if you look, frankly, at many of those who have migrated onto citizenship in this country, and you ask them what the methodology was, they didn't go through any application process in their foreign country. Many of them did not go through any application process in their foreign country. They came here on visas. They stayed. They never left. They married Americans, whatever. They, became embroiled and involved in their communities, and they ultimately applied for citizenship and were granted it. So it was a de facto immigration policy, but it was basically like, whoever can get here, you're going to have it. And if you follow the process, and this is true in the DACA debate as well, we're about ready to afford what is ultimately going to undeniably be some degree of citizenship status, maybe full citizenship status, to a large number of illegal immigrants in this country, and they're going to be rewarded only because they were bold enough to break the laws of the country. I mean, that's a reality that no one will really talk about that bluntly and obviously, but it's true. And immigration is like the only issue. I mean, you talk about like sanctuary cities and things like that. It's the only issue where it's like the violation of the law is not just permissible, but it's kind of cool. It's kind of like light. It's favored. You're rewarded for it. And that clearly has emerged in all of the sentiment that I think has emerged in opposition to the border. By the way, if you sort of ask like liberal Democrats, what is your policy for securing the border? I mean, the responses are laughable. Nancy Pelosi said the other day when she was in Arizona that her plan would be to mow the grass on the border because people were sneaking in through the thick brush. I mean, these are like laughable concepts. If you ask them, which no one ever does, if you say, so, we have chain migration, we have the visa lottery, we have the illegal immigration. If you ask them, like, how many foreigners should be coming into the country in any given year? Like, what's the limit? Like, what's the actual, because, my judgment, you could freeze immigration and we could probably be better off for a period of time and then ultimately open it up with where we are in the labor market and assimilation and other issues. But if you ask them and you said, well, what's the limit? Like, they don't even have a limit because there is none. Because to them, this is all about the politics. And you referenced the fact correctly that the president put forward a very generous offer of DACA, more than doubling the number of eligibles to participate in DACA. Well, weren't we just told over and over again that these dreamers were the best people in the world and we had to do something urgently for them? Well, Trump said, okay, let's do that. And in exchange, let's rein in this illogical visa lottery program and chain migration, and let's take care of the people that are here as a one-time occurrence. Because if you don't do that, you get another DACA coming in another 5 years, and then a second one in 10 years. Look, it never stops. And I think what the Democratic Party has said, and you can't say this loudly enough, is that this DACA thing is just a political pawn for them. They don't care about the dreamers, or they would have taken the deal. They care about the dreamers as leverage, as political pawns. And to them, this is politics. It's about votes, because while there are many exceptions, and you hate to stereotype it, these are mostly immigrants from very poor countries, predominantly Latin American countries, who are arriving here with nothing. Many of them immediately welfare dependent. They believe they're uniquely positioned to appeal to those voters. And that is the singular motivation behind their rhetoric on this. I mean, everything else, if you call them on it, it's nonsense. They have no immigration strategy. They have no real solid immigration positions. It's the more the merrier. That is their position, and whatever helps them politically at that moment. So now they want to go into the 2018 midterm elections. They didn't want to have the president or Republicans to be able to go out and say, and we took care of the DACA issue, right? It may not have been consistent with the president's rhetoric of the campaign, as you correctly point out, where he said that they've got to go back before they can get in line, more or less, to come back. But we resolved the issue, and we resolved it in a permanent way so that it doesn't happen again. Mm-hmm. They didn't want to afford the president that talking point. They didn't want to afford the president that political victory. So in essence, they said, we're going to let this DACA problem persist. And by the way, there have been a handful of DACA eligible and DACA participants who have now been deported. So I don't think it's a priority for ICE or for this government at all. In fact, just the opposite. I think they can look to avoid it, but they will be susceptible potentially, and there'll be certainly nothing illegal in their deportation. Though I think there'll be a lot of court-related challenges to it. But you had an issue to resolve this, and you had a president who I think, because he wants to break down the partisan divide that has Washington so gridlocked, where literally nothing gets done on anything, who offers a very generous solution to the problem, and he's rebuffed. And not, by the way, not like they even thought about it, quickly rebuffed, because this is not really about what Democrats say it's about. It's ultimately part of a larger political strategy, both on their talking points going into 2018 and also as it relates to their perceived political constituency.
Yeah, and I think we're getting at this really a problem in our politics right now, and you've experienced it yourself. Speaking at Cornell last year, you were protested vehemently by people on the left who didn't want to listen to your speech. So it's a problem.
They didn't even know what they were protesting.
Yeah, they weren't protesting your speech; they were protesting the idea of thought that differed from their own, and I think that's something that we can really get deeper to in our politics, and where you're talking about the Democrats using it just as political strategy. The dreamers really, to them, aren't these millions of kids or hundreds of thousands of kids in the country who need to stay here. They're a tool to get what they want, and as a result of that, they're not willing to listen to reasonable, logical arguments. And I think you get the same on the right. But really, it's a problem that's really pervading our politics at the moment, where people just don't want to listen to anything that they don't agree with. Specifically, they won't actually get into the policy and into the research and the facts, because behind everything there is a set basis of research, whether it's totally accurate or whether it's not, but there's at least a basis to go off of as to where we can move forward and help the most people. But it seems like in our political discourse right now, we're not talking about that research, and it's just the surface level stuff. So I do want to get into your speech at Cornell, because it's not so rare, but getting to talk to someone who has been on a college campus and then been rejected, that's, I guess, really makes you a conservative speaker that the left despises. So what?
Well, they are intimidated by facts. That's the reality. If you asked any one of those individuals to articulate issues that we're addressing, or the practical reality of this debate, you quickly understand that then this is consistent with the entire thesis of resist. It's not their thesis is not, hey, win the debate or explain our positions or come up with better policies. Those would be like really constructive approaches. If I were running the Democratic Party right now, I wouldn't be saying resist. I would say come up with better solutions. Come up with something that works better than what the president's doing, or support the president if he's right. But their political credibility lies on a monopoly of their ability to control the so-called narrative and political dialogue in the country. So if they're having to explain, say, answer the questions I just answered, how many immigrants, or why won't we secure the border? Like, what's the case for not securing the border? Or, why should we have the highest tax rate in the world, corporate tax rate in the world? Like, they have no answers to those questions. They want to shut down those questions, and they want to change the debate around these very subjective, usually inaccurate, emotionally charged sentiments that will allow them to forge forward politically without any dialogue or resistance at all. And the conservative movement, like my first experience, we used to talk about winning the battle of ideas. That's still something that I think you find most conservatives say. One of the goals is to win the battle of ideas, to explain why our ideas should be adopted by the American people, right? We operate on a thesis. I operate on a thesis that it's up to the American people to decide which one of these two visions or many visions for the future of the country is in the country's best interest. That's the way it should work. Their methodology is not one of engaging at that level. It's one of shutting down completely any opposition. It's a very totalitarian approach, frankly. It's manifested, obviously, in the most extreme cases on these campuses. I mean, what's happened, like at Berkeley, and what's happened, just you can go on and on. Like every day there's one of these stories. And there's always, as there was in my case, at Cornell, which you mentioned, there's always some, the security issues used as it's kind of like a euphemism for shutting down the debate without actually saying it. Like they've developed a whole strategy on how to shut down any representation of conservative thought. It's true in the media, obviously, as well, where the factual presentation or representation of conservative ideas or Trump-oriented ideas, it's not that it's like presented and discounted. It's like more or less shut out. And you can, go in any areas of influence. It's clearly the case. I mean, it's the centerpiece of this whole lie about Russian collusion, where you literally have these Democrats making hugely suggestive, almost libelous, I believe they are libelous, insinuations regarding what they believe happened, but which they will not communicate because it's, classified. That's the basis on which they're never having to explain their positions. And the goal of this movement in the country is not to offer a political alternative to the president and to explain why it's a preferred approach and why it's in the best interest of the country to adopt it. It is to pull this president out of office in a high-profile impeachment that sends the message that sensible, contrarian ideas will not just be shut down in the present tense, but a message to anyone who tries to do it in the future, they're going to be. So in my judgment, and then you've got like everything that's going on, just even people that are passively involved. Like, what is the message we're really, like, in my judgment, the best thing that could happen in the country would be the people with good intention, the people that want the best for the country and want the best for their communities, get as involved as possible. Whatever your ideology is, whatever your party affiliation is, if you're well-intentioned, like, don't just sit around and complain. Try to get engaged and fix things. That's like the spirit of Americanism, and it's the spirit of democracy. And we are in a stigmatizing era where individuals who take that approach um, are not disputed on a basis of facts or presented with an alternative, theory about the direction of the country, but are shut down. And I think it represents really, in essence, what's happened to modern liberalism. I mean, if you were actually going to define like the ideology that governed the Obama administration, it'd be very difficult to actually pinpoint. I mean, clearly they were big believers in using government as a means to their end. But ultimately, if you ask me, it was not a particularly ideological administration. It aligned with corporate interests. It aligned with foreign governments, hostile governments. It was really whatever was in their self-interest at the moment. So it's tough, I think, for many in the conservative, clearly the conservative movement as a whole, but I'm sure it's also true of people that are, I think the Bernie Sanders candidacy reflected this, even people on the other side who are well-intentioned, to kind of know how to counteract that, because you're fighting with a bowl of jelly. It's like there's not ever a counter punch that's based on fact. It's all just behind the back mechanisms that they perfected and that are taught, in the so-called Saul Alinsky school. I mean, it's all out there. It's, it's a whole school of thought about how to shut down, isolate their opponents. And it's terrifyingly Orwellian and at its core totalitarian.
So how do we get back to this, or a more policy-based politics, instead of this bickering back and forth? And almost, I think if you were to define some of what we see in our political sphere right now, it's really more emotionally based politics, where I'm supporting something because this specific issue I have a certain feeling about, and that's going to guide how I support it, right or left, or whatever I want on that issue. So it's not based on anything. It's just based on, like, do I want to offend someone? Do I want to like all of the conversations that we've been having here and all the topics that we've covered, like, I feel that it's like they're not controversial, but they are, and what today's left in the media, and you just don't hear these types of conversations. I mean, you say anything and you're called all the phobics and obics and whatever, and the is, and you can't have conversations.
That's the utter saddening reality, if you are where I am, is it's non-existent. And I hate even having to dive into the details of it, but like many of my strongest personal relationships and alliances in the Tea Party movement from the very beginning were with African Americans involved in very high level positions in our movement. I mean, the whole thing is like absurd, and I don't like to even play to it. I think once you even get into the position of having to defend something that doesn't exist, you lost. The other side is exceptionally good in being able to shout down and discredit, or just shut down a debate. It's ultimately about that for them. I think inherent in it, like, is a recognition that their policies are elitist, that they are not really in the best interest of the country, that they are not justifiable in any public grassroots capacity, and that they cannot win this battle of ideas, so they need to dodge and shut down the battle of ideas. And as you just saw, like what I said with NAFTA, which, it's a tough thing to say, sort of say, hey, look, I looked at this thing one way, and then, as is always the case for me, I evaluated things not based on some rigid textbook of ideology, but on the factual recognition of what's actually happening. I kind of looked at it, and my view on it evolved. It evolved based on factual recognition. It's not very helpful to my, if you're engaged in any way in commentary on these issues, what do you want to be known for? You want to be known for being right all the time. Mm-hmm. But no one holds these people accountable for any of that, and no one is ever inclined in this. Unfortunately, it's true on our side too, to ever sort of say, maybe I called that one wrong. Okay, if people during, on Fox and news and just like in really high profile ways during the Trump candidacy who said I was handing the presidency to Hillary Clinton. All right. Now, I'm not going to call these guys out by name, but these are like really identifiable people that are in leadership, high profile positions. Okay. They never come forward and go, wow, I really had that wrong, Michael. You were right. I was wrong. It's just kind of move on to the next thing and they keep going. And in a way, the entire structure, which you seem to kind of grasp, is not suited and it's not conducive to what I think is the importance of deliberative evaluation of real facts, maybe melded with ideology, but facts that are, real time. Mm-hmm. We have a system that's just set up on the perpetuation of powerful interests and a paradigm which is the reason I supported Trump from day one, that if you don't break this paradigm, everything else is just an illusion. And, you're dealing with even the two-party system, in my judgment, like you'd ask what can be done. We really got to take a look at that. Like, is the two-party system, like what higher end is it serving in 2018 in this country? I mean, we have people that are going to war to protect the party just because they're part of it. And they view their own political futures and their political careers to the success of one party over another party. And in many cases, as I pointed out in a number of these examples, and as you've pointed out as well, the positions aren't even consistent, right? We talked about the border issue. I mean, the Democratic Party has completely done a 180 on that. They fought just as hard when they fought the first time. Now they're fighting hard on the other side. It's not like it's over principle. It's just over the protection of special interest power. And I believe the breakdown in dialogue and in the breakdown in any degree of bipartisanship. And just think about it. Like, when was the last time you saw like a legitimate committee hearing where like experts are being called and people are questioned, and, like legislation and statutes are like really, amended and considered. Like even on a just legislative day-to-day basis, everything that you learned about how you think the Congress operates is wrong in 2018. Everything stems out of leadership offices, not out of members of Congress or even out of committees. If it's not supported on a leadership level, it goes nowhere. And the idea that anyone can even go down as a member of Congress and just start introducing bills that get passed and that change the direction of things is like, it's almost illusion. It's an illusion. And I counsel people, I talk to people all the time, as you can imagine, who are either running for federal office or hold federal office. One of the unspoken realities is that for those who run thinking they're going to go down and change the direction of things, they pretty quickly realize how rigged completely the system is against participatory democracy and how things are routinely done behind closed doors by very few select individuals, very commonly with lobbyists and special interests. And pretty commonly, you got, to be fair, we criticized like Pelosi for not allowing members of Congress to read bills before they were voted on. That practice hasn't really changed too substantially. Even under the current leadership, now on our side, there's not enough deliberation on the detail of these things. And, the very writing the statute, it's hugely complex, done by congressional attorneys in a certain, language and speak that isn't even always, even if you're involved in it, comprehensible, much less the magnitude of ramifications that come out of these things. Like what Pelosi said is more or less true. We pass these bills and then we find out what the ramifications are. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm suggesting, I know what our Tea Party believes is the same on this, is that is completely backwards. We need to have more constructive, broad participation and a full understanding of what's involved with these things. We need to break down a lot of this double speak, a lot of the closed door things. We need more transparency. We need less centralization of power in the parties and in Congress. And I believe, like I said, we got to like ask ourselves. This is a question I'm pondering because I'm like, this is the way I do things. I just do things the way I do them. I can't like necessarily make everyone do them this way. But it's a question I've been asking myself like for almost a year now is like, what? Because I can list all of the downsides of our rigid two-party system and the realities that are being created by that. And then you start to say, well, what are the upsides of it? Like, why should we preserve that particular structure? It's not in our Constitution. It's not, it's not even something that stems back to origins of the country. It's evolved over time.
I mean, it literally dates back to George Washington's farewell address saying, stay away from the party system and stay away from parties. And personally, I really do believe that my generation, the younger generation, is moving away from the two-party system. I mean, you saw with the rise of Bernie Sanders, obviously very extreme, but that's not really a part of the Democratic policy so much or party so much. And then even the rise of Trump, it's very different from what the Republican Party had been standing for, as you've mentioned. And then even talked with Austin Peterson a few weeks ago from the Libertarian Party, and even the Libertarian movement was growing in 2016. So, I mean, whether it's the rise of a third party that's full of these moderates, because honestly, right now it's like you're getting the two total extremes, and it really is just a competition to see who can get the best party. So I really believe that we are almost moving away from this, and where people are going to hopefully start analyzing on more of a issue to issue basis on what they agree with. And I do see that kind of the libertarian standpoint almost is going to become a little more common, because I think when you really get down to it, people aren't like they might say one thing like I'm for this, but then when it actually ends up affecting them, then you get a much more moderate stance. A lot of the policies on both sides are just there to almost attract people to them, and like, oh yeah, I agree with that. But then when it actually ends up affecting them in real life, and this is changing how I'm living, then maybe I don't actually agree with that so much. And I think that the parties are really getting at that, and it's really noisy and unattractive to be a part of either one of these parties at the moment. Honestly, I lean more to the right, but I think some of the policies on the other side aren't so bad. So it's like we could take and mix, and I think that that's going to be more common in the years coming up.
Yeah, I think we're on the same page on that. I mean, I like libertarianism, and I know you're very closely affiliated with it, and I'm schooled in it and sympathetic with it, and would say that it applies in some of my outlook. It's definitely had a great intellectual impact on me, but libertarianism is a movement that is hugely impactful on a sort of intellectual and conceptual level, and it's frankly struggled on a political level. So all of this energy and support that exists, Cato Institute on down, right, with all these very successful organizations that have driven, very creative libertarian thinking that I have many times agreed with and many times disagreed with. But I would always say it's proven immensely thoughtful and impactful on an intellectual level. That momentum, unlike in our Tea Party movement, has never transformed into the success of the Libertarian Party as any political force in the country. And, the only role the Libertarian Party has now is some spoiler for Democrats in drawing a few points away from a Republican, since I believe almost always that's where those votes come out of. Mm-hmm. But in the modern era, like one of the questions, I'm not saying this is like the direction, but one of the questions you have to ask is like, where people are going in and just pulling ballots based on party affiliation, and they don't even know the individuals involved. They haven't really studied their positions, their voting histories, their platforms. Would it not be like more advantageous potentially just have individuals run? Just have them run, and these are their positions, and you're going to have some degree of cohesiveness ideologically that will emerge. It's kind of more consistent with, say, the Congressional caucus system, which is to say it's not rigidly adhered to, but it represents a body of thought, than it is to sort of force everybody into one of the, the red pill or the blue pill. And, and then you just see these bodies like in 2018, like literally every Democrat just votes like in line. Why? You know why they do that? Because Schumer and Pelosi call these guys. They say, we need you on this. They're not on the receiving end of these calls. Where you get these calls, and when you're in the Senate, like, this is a leadership vote. That's code language for do what we're telling you, or there's going to be consequences. It's kind of like mafia speak, frankly, And it still goes on all the time, both parties, where leadership draws the line in the sand. Now, obviously, they can't put the voting card in the machine. The member of Congress does that. If you want to go down and deviate from your party's leadership, you are going to pay a price that is unbelievably monstrous. You're going to be on the worst committees. Your legislation or things that you support will never reach the floor. Your party support will dry up. You will have primary opposition that otherwise wouldn't exist. And the place will become very miserable to work in. Like, literally, they'll walk by you in the halls and say hello, stuff like that. I mean, and when you see all of these guys that are like resigning recently, then you can go through the list. Some of them are really good, members of Congress who've, I think, done a good job. They're leaving, even though they're not saying it, is a recognition of the fact that this job isn't lived up to what they thought it was going to be. They've come to the conclusion that, it's really a leadership-driven system, and that the role of the individual member, and even on the congressional committees, I mean, on Gowdy leaving from South Carolina, I mean, like, you can't tell me that he hasn't sat there on the oversight committee, seeing all of these complete violations, like literally people ignoring subpoenas, perjuring themselves under oath, and no ramifications for many of it. And you start to say, this is just a show. It's not the system is not functioning as it's intended to function. And I do agree with you. I would instruct anyone, if you're like just now pondering engagement on any level in politics, go back to 1792, look at Washington's farewell, address and letter, and the positions that were held in it. It's not terribly long. It's bullet pointed, as I recall from reading it. And every one of those positions is instructive, both as it relates to the founding principles of the country, but also as it relates to guidance for those who would come after him. Sort of, so that this is our experience of, what you need to, what you're going to encounter and what you need to avoid. And I think it's just a hugely instructive address. I don't know why we call it an address, because I think it was written, not spoken, but it's exceptional.
Same with the State of the Union, but I think
shorter,
definitely shorter. But I mean, one of the solutions that I've always thought would be interesting to propose, and I know California has now instituted them, but term limits on the members of Congress. Because when you look at the private market and the free market, all the laissez-faire economics, really what people are arguing for is that humans, and they have like an intense desire to get ahead and better themselves and create a name for themselves and participate in this competition to where they can win. I think that honestly in politics, that's about probably the only place that it's really bad to have this type of competition between just individuals, and then but also what the two-party system has become is like the two teams. And you see it when the NFL viewership is declining, whether or not that's because of the protests, but even before the flag protests, sports viewership in the United States, I believe, was declining. And I think
Right.
part of that is due to the fact that our politics have almost become our entertainment.
Right, it's too affirming. I mean, people don't want to hear individuals wrestling to sort of find the truth. They want to hear individuals adamantly telling them beyond any shadow of a doubt that this is the way the world works. And then it's just sort of presented. And even if it's actually inaccurate, and even if they're wrong about everything they say, then they're just sort of back. Because like you said, it's a very prescient point, is it's become entertainment. This is too serious to be entertainment. And that's what I think is giving rise to kind of both the Tea Party movement and the Trump populism is a recognition that this is not a game. These are people's lives. I had someone from I'm not going to mention the network, but a very identifiable conservative broadcast personality asked me during the healthcare debate when it was clear that this thing was starting to fail and Obama would not make any adjustments to it that wasn't this positive, because they were going to own this horrible legislation and it was going to be so politically devastating to the Democratic Party and the Obama administration. And I'm like, no, you need to subjugate political aspiration to the fact that you're dealing with real impact on people's lives. So in healthcare policy, you got to, every policy, you got to take partisan consideration out of it and do what is the right thing to do and what is conducive by the rules of the game, which are the Constitution. And so that's kind of the way I've approached all of these things, to sort of say, look, it's not a lawless or do anything world. We have a guiding document, the U.S. Constitution, that is pretty specific in what it does and does not delegate as far as authority and what the domain of our government is. And then you've got what's in the best interest of people within that framework. That's the sort of discussion we should have. And it should never be about, this is in my personal interest, or this is in my party's interest, or this is going to make someone else look bad. And in the commentary area as well, it's always got to be about an intellectual undertaking of getting to facts and truth, and not being bashful about, changing course if a change of course is recognized. That's not principalness. That's in itself an ideology of just practical realism, and one that I think the American people have an absolute expectation that they're going to get. As far as term limits go, which I fully support, I mean, our founders envisioned a citizen legislature, not a professional legislator that was going to spend 4 or 5 decades there. That's absurd. And these people would come so detached from reality and from their constituencies. The only thing I always add is term limits, which some of the opponents of term limits, I think, make a good point on, is that if you're going to limit the terms of Congress, you almost have to also limit the bureaucracy, right? Because one of the arguments is that, say, if you put in a 4-term limit in the House, so you got somebody who can't do more than 8 years. Well, by the time you're in your 6th, 7th, or 8th year, you're just in the position where you're really starting to understand from an oversight capacity what's going on inside the executive office of government in the executive capacity. So you really also, I think, have to limit the civil servants. So just like we shouldn't have at least with legislators, at least they're still having to go back and face voters every 2 years or every 6 years. Mm-hmm. These bureaucrats they're not accountable to anyone. No one knows their names. They make decisions behind closed doors. They're not accountable to the people. And just like is the case now, they spend, an entire 5-decade career sometimes doing these things. That's equally dangerous.
And I really do believe that the founding fathers didn't intend for a lot of the things that have become so normal to us in our political system to actually have happened. I mean, there's so much going on in our political system that was not intended by the founders, not just the extensive government or whatever else, but just the parties, the career politicians, and the influence of special interests. So ingrained in our politics that we don't even notice anymore, and then it's almost as though we find ancillary causes that we can blame, and those might be problems, but I think that there's this root cause of a lot of the problems in our political system that it really has become a game, as we're kind of getting at, that it's not about people's lives, it's not about improving the general welfare or providing access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's about winning and making a name for yourself. And it's if you want to make a name for yourself, then go into business or go into entertainment or maybe become the president. But past that, maybe politics aren't the place for that.
This has to be about people, and I'm sure there's a lot of things I don't do well, but one thing I've tried to do throughout all of it, everything that I've done to date, and particularly in the Tea Party movement, is to just represent these ideas and empower other people, not me, other people, to move forward in articulating and leading these charges. Because if you want to be effective, you can't do it alone. That's rule number one. And I've almost, from a psychology standpoint, concluded that many of the precise individualist traits that make Tea Party members and conservatives so correct on policy issues also can make them hugely ineffectual in an activist standpoint. Because while we are ultimately a country of individuals and individual rights need to be predominantly respected, political engagement is a communal undertaking. And the power always comes in that incremental person who joins and is part of it. And if you don't have numbers, which we traditionally have not had, at least before this movement, I don't believe we ever had. I mean, the Republican Party is not a grassroots movement. It's a hollow shell of whoever's filling it at the moment, of of donors and people who participate in local leadership positions. It's not really something that nobody goes around enthusiastically articulating their affiliation with either of these parties, because, like you said, neither of them are all that appealing on the surface. What's appealing is ultimately what comes out of the sausage making machine at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. And just to your point, finally, I would say, just having gone through this horrible Florida shooting, and I'm listening to this debate, obviously, which you knew this is just like night follows day would come, that Second Amendment issues would come up. And as much as my views on that are no secret, the Second Amendment, which states that the right to keep and bear arms was necessary to the security of a free state, right? Mm-hmm. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's implanted in my understanding of the Constitution. If you ponder just like how absolutist that position is, shall not be infringed. I come back and ask the question of, haven't we been engaged in a multi-decade infringement on this right? Which is fine. I'm not but let's be honest about what we're doing. When we start to dictate that you can own this weapon, not that weapon, you got to have a holding time. We're putting all kinds of infringements on that right. The way to those have got to be. You got to go back to the Constitution, because and this has been the problem, I think, with statutes generally, at least since the Second World War, if not before, is that we just kind of have this continual erosion of these rights without saying, hold it, the Constitution does have a mechanism in place for us to amend it. So if that Second Amendment, which I defend, is not serving, in the viewpoint of the American people, our interests in the 21st century, then our founders were so wise, they put in place a political methodology to amend it. So you could, for instance, go back and say, well, this right is to be afforded to everyone except this group of people. And, oh, by the way, within the constraints of this. Mm-hmm. I think the genius of the founders was they wrote the Constitution knowing with foresight that decades and centuries later, the country would be a very different place than it was when they wrote it. And they probably didn't know exactly how it would be different. They probably could never envision many things that have transpired in this country, development of technology, and the globalist nature of commerce, and all of the complexities that have emerged since then that complicate that document potentially. But they did, to their genius, provide methodology to amend it. And I just think, as opposed to forcing all this stuff into statutes that erodes and contradicts that document, the better approach is to use the mechanism the founders afforded us to amend the Constitution through acts of Congress or through the states, two different courses, both available for us to do. And that's where this whole Second Amendment thing should be going, is that maybe the viewpoints of the country have changed, and obviously the technologies have changed, right? I mean, that's one of the biggest things, is that they could never have envisioned AR-15s and things like that when this was written. Nor could they envision that we would have modern day police forces that are pretty responsive, not immediately responsive, but you call 911, you have somebody there in an urban area in 10 minutes, in a rural area, maybe 20 minutes. A lot of damage can be done in that time, but you've got, some degree of public defense didn't exist. So I believe you got to go back to that and let's have that debate over whether that amendment needs to be either subsequently amended, or I'm sure there's some purists out there who just like to rescind it. Let them come forward and let's have that discussion, because that's one where I think you would see a lot of political energy emerge and a lot of people would come out of the woodwork and have some pretty passionate viewpoints on that.
It would be very interesting to see where that would go. I think we could end up seeing close to almost a second civil war on that front.
Well, everybody avoids the controversial details. So let's assume that you actually ban the AR-15, which is an oversimplified technology. It's a valuable weapon. But assume you did do that. Are you going to go and begin banging on people's doors to actually take these things back? I really think the people that are engaged in advancing these positions need to be asked some difficult questions that they're not being asked, and need to be involved in more of a consideration of the details of what's involved and the negative ramifications of what's involved, as opposed to just soaring on their emotional and political rhetoric. And let me just, obviously footnote, no one wants to see what just happened happen. That's fact. It's also a fact no one wants to irrationally erode constitutionally granted rights of the American people. And if those two things are in a collision, you got to go back to the Constitution, not to the statute.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think that the Florida shooting specifically was almost the perfect example of what we were talking about earlier with these partisan games and the fear to actually do something. Because when you actually take an objective look at what happened in Florida, it wasn't, obviously a gun was used and there were many weapons involved on the kids' end, but there was almost a complete and total failure of our law enforcement systems to enforce the laws that we already have in place. The shooter himself called the police on himself to report that he feared that he would explode. A close family member called, and on top of that, I believe there were 39 calls to the local sheriff's department, as well as reports to the FBI on how the shooter was
spanning a year.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's one thing to talk about the Second Amendment, and I don't really have a solid stance on that. I don't believe too far either way, but it's one thing to talk about when guns are actually the problem, when the NRA is actually the problem, when the people who own guns may be the problem, which is obviously not the case here. But you have to look at what actually happened. This wasn't the fault of the lack of gun regulations.
That's the point. The singular point is that let's just start with the fact that Stoneman Douglas High School, Parkland, Florida, is a gun-free zone, right? So that's regulation, guideline, law. It's illegal to bring any weapon onto the grounds of that. Now, was that statute that have any practical ramification in deterring this? No, it didn't. And it leads you to the subsequent conclusion that when you go through it, there's a whole series of violations that are committed by anyone who does this. The rule of law is not a sufficient deterrent.
The law isn't doing anything necessarily. Maybe we can look at punishments for these types of crimes and look at increasing those as a deterrent. But I think that a lot of the problem here comes down to not only what we as a society are standing for and putting into our kids' minds, but also the fact that when you have a non-responsive police department in an agency, you have to look at fixing that. And I think, honestly, that's part of the problem with a lot of this national media and these national politics is this should be a problem being fixed specifically in Parkland, Florida with the police department. There should be deputies, the ones who are waiting outside, as was reported, there were 4 deputies waiting outside. They should be being punished and being evaluated and and why that happened. I mean, it shouldn't necessarily have become a national debate on guns as opposed to a national debate on how we can make sure to improve our law enforcement. This is one instance where I think that the hammer has to come down a little bit on these agencies. The media, whoever is propagating the discourse in our country right now, is choosing the wrong things to look at. And I think that we could actually be effective. And
it comes back to everything we're saying. Why is that happening? Is it because they are so passionately concerned and moved by the 17 kids killed in Parkland, or is it because they have an agenda? Because they have an agenda. I mean, I think one of the best points, and this, I think, has prompted a discourse and some solutions that seem to me to be very reasonable. Like, for instance, why do we protect airports and banks and government buildings, but not schools? Why are they not part of? Why is that not equally important? It would seem reasonable, offset only by the argument I can think of the cost involved, which is not a very compelling argument against it, that you would want to have a reasonable degree of security in these schools, which, by the way, many schools are more secure than this one appeared to be. You know, most schools you can't just sort of walk up like this guy was banned from and was known to everyone. I mean, he just was not a member of the schools, you know. I mean, he sort of seemed to have fairly free entry into the place. And I think that points to one of the more obvious deficiencies in this process. But you could have made the AR-15 illegal. He would have bought it illegally, just like he went onto that property illegally with weapons, shot people illegally. You know, I mean, with every one of these mass shootings, you've got, you know, a dozen, 24 statutes that are violated. The rule of law is not a sufficient deterrent to someone who's in that state of mind. It never will be. You're talking about the human capacity to outlaw evil, and you cannot outlaw evil. You can only contain it.
And fight it. And I think that really comes down on a lot of what we've been talking about with a problem that has been so subverted into talking about the typical narrative. And I think it's really it's kind of disgusting how a lot of these survivors have been, I mean, almost exploited. At this point, I guess it's some of their own choice.
I think by the way, I don't think there's been enough reporting on that, but I think, you know, it'll probably come. I think you're going to probably look into this and you're going to find that this whole Never Again organization that emerged from it has probably got very powerful forces behind. I mean, you know, I don't doubt the sincerity of these kids. I don't doubt that they certainly should be heard. I agree with that as well. You know, their voice should be, their input on this should be valued. Traumatic, and they had first-person observation, which most Americans haven't had of this, including with the perpetuator of the violence. But you know, have they, to your point, been manipulated by people with others' agendas? I mean, that's unfortunately in an inauthentic political world. The reality is that a lot of these things are manipulated by professionals. I mean, the political imaging and the opportunities, there's a lot of money and power involved on both sides, and too much of an inclination, I think, for, you know, that to happen, as opposed to just having a more sober assessment and asking realistically, is there really another law that would have precluded this guy from doing this, or was it more the security of the school itself, which I believe is the ultimate takeaway, is that this school was not sufficiently secured. And then that problem was compounded by the fact that it certainly does appear that you had a Broward County Sheriff's Office that was not sufficiently responsive to and didn't follow its protocols in responding to a mass shooting.
We could probably talk all day, but I think that we'll have to start wrapping things up a little bit. So where can our audience then find you on social media, or where can they get in contact with you?
Sure. On Twitter, my name is a single word, Michael Johns. On Facebook, my Facebook page is Michael Johns Tea Party. And, you know, those are probably the two best go-to places.
Well, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you, Luke. Appreciate it.
And that about brings us to the end of episode 32. If you missed the first part of our interview, the discussion of how Michael Johns founded the Tea Party, you can go and find that on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever else you get your podcast. Also on theedgeofideas.com, which is where all of my podcasts and show notes are published. So be sure to check that out. Put a lot of work into the show notes, and they're very extensive with a lot of quotes, and they kind of help you follow along. So next week, I'll be interviewing Case Lawrence, who is deeply involved in the experience economy and founded and sold his own multi-million-dollar company. So looking forward to that conversation and sharing it with you. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to check out my interview with Jordan A. Brown on the Igora podcast. He talks with me about my motivation for starting Bills with Luke Scorzell, as well as some background in my episodes and the podcast in general. And again, thank you so much to Zach for his $30 per month Patreon support, to Mike, Julie, and Tiana for their $15 support, and to Sue and Ben for their $5 support. Be sure to head over to patreon.com and learn how you can become a supporter of Bills with Luke Scorzell. Obviously, if you are on any of those levels, then you get some special shout-outs at the beginning and end of each show. And also with any $2 support, you get access to all of my podcast episodes in advance. Any $2 and above patrons had access to this episode a week early, and actually specifically the full interview that was unedited and had everything in there. So be sure to head over to patreon.com, see how you can subscribe, and get a pretty cool sticker out of the deal for your laptop, phone, water bottle, or whatever else you'd like. Again, go over to iTunes. Greatly appreciate it if you leave a nice review, or even if you just leave us a 5-star rating. Head over to theedgeofideas.com/subscribe to get updates when new podcasts come out. We have them out every Wednesday. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I'll see you next week. I'm Luke Scorzell, and you're listening to Bills.